Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church. Welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where in today's lesson we are going to continue our consideration of Leviticus chapter 18, which we began in the last lesson. Remember that we are in this section of the Holiness Code in the book of Leviticus. It runs from chapter 17 through chapter 26. And we've looked at chapter 17, began looking at chapter 18 last week on boundaries within sexual relationships. And so we are going to look in more detail about the actual content of chapter 18 in today's lesson, looking at sexual relationships in the covenant. There's three things I want us to see about this chapter, sexual relationships in the covenant. This contains a call to covenant faithfulness, a call to covenant holiness, and a call to covenant life. So those are the three things I want to consider. So the first thing, just a couple points, thinking about this, the contents of this chapter is a call to covenant faithfulness. The instructions that we read about in Leviticus chapter 18, which once again, we are not going to take the time to read as part of the video lesson, so please take a moment to read actual verses in chapter 18. And you'll notice that these instructions are informed by the covenant relationship that God has established with his people, which is a covenant of grace. We read in verses 2, 4, 5, and verse 30, this reoccurring phrase, I am Yahweh, or I am the Lord your God. And he's emphasizing that he has entered into covenant relationship with his people. And so all these instructions, not just in chapter 18, but through the Holiness Code, are given within that framework, this covenantal framework, call to faithfulness. But what's important about that is to understand that these instructions in Leviticus 18, these boundaries in sexual relationships, are given by the Lord who saved Israel from bondage. Remember that Leviticus is taking place just as the people have come out of centuries of bondage as slaves in Egypt. And the Lord who has redeemed them, who has rescued them, wants to keep them free and flourishing and enjoying life. Shalom, peace, life, a fullness of life, a wellness of life. And keeping these boundaries, honoring these boundaries is part of doing that. And we actually see evidence of that, I would argue, in our culture today, in the West, and particularly in North America and in the United States. I mean, just think about the question, with all of our expressions of sexual freedom, are we really free today? I mean, consider the number of people who are struggling with sexual addictions. Consider the number of unwanted pregnancies. Consider how sexual infidelity and adultery tears families apart and leaves many people, many children disconnected from one or both parents, or having to bounce between living with one parent or another parent. It's a destroying force, adultery and divorce. A destroying force within our culture. Think about the prevalence of sex trafficking, which is connected to the pornography industry, and how the pornography industry actually leads to many sexual dysfunctions when people are addicted to those kinds of things. So if you just step back and think, are we free with all of our sexual freedom? It would seem like there's enough data to at least question that. And I think there's enough data to actually answer that question in the negative, that we are less free because we ignore God's boundaries. And we read about these boundaries here in the context of this covenant. He calls us to covenant faithfulness to him as a God who has redeemed us from our bondage to sin and wants us to live as a free people, not in bondage to our desires. So that we can truly be free, we can be flourishing, we can be healthy, we can experience shalom. So that's first thing, a call to covenant faithfulness. But let's get into the actual content of the chapter, a call to covenant holiness. As we look at the stipulations, regulations, requirements, prohibitions in the chapter, it's really a call to separate, which remembers that key idea with holiness. It's a call to separate from the practices of the nations. It's not uncommon for pagan nations, particularly pagan nations in the past, to be very licentious when it comes to sexual expression. You can look historically at all these kinds of phallic symbols and statues celebrating and worshiping sex, and the temple cult and all these things in various religions in the past. But that was not to be the case in Israel. That was the case among the Canaanites. That was not to be the case with Israel, because the Lord wanted more for them. He wanted them to enjoy, again, flourishing and stability, and that requires boundaries in sexual relationships. And so we can look at a couple things. The first thing we see in verses 6 through 19 in the chapter are the relationships that are forbidden, relationships within the family, specifically avoiding sexual relationships with those who are the flesh of his flesh. We see this phrase again come up in chapter 21, verses 2 and 3, about not becoming unclean except for close family members, but with contact with the dead. I should clarify that. Not becoming unclean by having contact with the dead except for close family members. And you have a list of close family members that are given there. That phrase is used again there, the flesh of his flesh. And so what we read here in verses 6 through 19 are forbidden sexual relationships within the family, which are basically no close relative. We are not to enter into sexual relationships with close relatives who are close relatives either by blood, meaning genetically, or by marriage. So both of those are ruled out. In-laws and things like that are ruled out. And so here's how that actually breaks down. Forbidden sexual relationships with mother, verse 7, a stepmother, again by marriage, verse 8, sister, verse 9, granddaughter, verse 10, stepsister, verse 11, an aunt, daughter-in-law, a brother's wife. Note how John the Baptist in his ministry was put into prison because he was speaking out against Herod's relationship with his brother's wife, which was forbidden by law, which is what John said. Herod didn't like hearing that, so he put him in prison. A woman and her daughter entering into sexual relationship with those people at the same time. A wife's sister as a rival while she's still living. And that's an important point here, that a person could marry his wife's sister, but not while his wife was alive, as a rival. That's forbidden in verse 18. And again, you might start putting together that aren't there instances of this happening earlier than Leviticus. For example, Jacob married both Rachel and Leah, and of course there was a rivalry. And that's something I mentioned in the last lesson, that in every instance, although you don't see these explicit renunciations of polygamy in the scriptures, although it's not common. I mean, often what you see, you think of David and Solomon, but remember those are kings, and for kings to have concubines was very common in the ancient Near East, but probably the average Israelite living in his or her tent did not have multiple spouses. But we do see it in Genesis. Jacob marries both Rachel and Leah, and of course, it's not good. And so even though you don't get these explicit renunciations of polygamy, every story in the scripture shows how detrimental and destructive it is to relationships and to family dynamics, and it has far-reaching effects. And so that's forbidden as well, a wife's sister as a rival while she is still living. Now, there is one exception to this close relative prohibition, and that is levirate marriages, which were allowed when a brother can take his brother's wife in order to produce offspring if the brother has died and left his widow childless. In other words, two brothers, one brother is married, he dies, doesn't have children, that brother can take his brother's wife to bear children. But keep in mind, again, this levirate marriage only applies when the brother has died. Leviticus 18 assumes that these relatives are living at the time, some of them, certainly not all of them. But when it comes to in-laws, there are some exceptions to that. But note here also that what these regulations disallow is for the more powerful men in a family to exploit and use the more vulnerable women who are nearest to them. Certainly with just physical power, they might be able to abuse and to molest and to rape and to force into sexual relationships, but God's law is forbidding all of that, that the more powerful men in the family, whether that comes from stature, status, or actual physical strength, are not permitted to exploit the more vulnerable women who are in that relation, who are in that family. And so again, we see instance of God's grace operating here and protecting those who are weaker physically, those who are more vulnerable in society, which is something we see consistently in Scripture, and interestingly, something that opponents of the Scriptures seem to miss, that they're always complaining that there's these patriarchal, abusive, oppressive kinds of systems in there. But if we read the Bible carefully, we see that God is a God who liberates people from oppression and cares for the weak and the marginalized. And here's one instance of that. Now, some people reading this might wonder, if they're reading it carefully, they might be surprised that there's no mention of a prohibition between father-daughter sexual relationships or brother-sister, which would seem to be the most common kinds of incestuous relationships to actually prohibit. Well, a couple of reasons why that might be absent. One is that father-daughter sexual intercourse would not be as likely in ancient Near East civilizations because of the insistence on virgin daughters who would bring a bride price to the father and to the family. And so to remove evidence that a daughter was actually a virgin would nullify a marriage. There's a financial hit that a father would take for that. So there was an inbuilt protection against those kinds of things, at least in this cultural context. Of course, that doesn't exist today, and it is sadly a common form of incest, father-daughter, father sexually abusing a daughter. But that may not have been as likely in the ancient Near East, which is one reason why you may not see it here. Also, a father-daughter, brother-sister are already ruled out simply by the language of close relative in verse 6, flesh of his flesh. If you look at that phrase again as it comes up in Leviticus 21 in a different context, again about touching or becoming unclean by touching the dead, except for close relatives, daughters and brothers and sons are mentioned there specifically. So certainly an Israelite reading this would understand that a daughter or a brother or a sister would be ruled out as a close relative. A close relative certainly would include those relationships. So that's why we may not see an explicit mention of those relationships in the actual text. Okay, so that's the forbidden sexual relationships within the family. We also go on to read in verses 20 through 23, forbidden sexual relationships outside the family or not family-based. And so we see a number of those. I'll just mention them. It was forbidden to enter into sexual relationships while the female was menstruating. And the likely reason for this is because there's no life in that. Again, a woman ovulates kind of right in the middle of menstrual periods and has about a 2 to 3 day period before and after ovulation to actually conceive, and then of course the menstrual period lies on the far ends of that middle time period, and so there's no life in that. And we're going to see in some of these other prohibitions that when there's no life, it's prohibited because God is a God of life, building life. The original mandate given even in Genesis chapter 1 is to be fruitful and multiply. Again, that's not to suggest that every single person is to reproduce and to have children. Some people are single, but it does give a trajectory, and I think that trajectory is informing some of what we read here in Leviticus 18 about forbidden sexual relationships outside the family. Adultery actually would not fit into that category. Certainly you could conceive children in adulterous relationships. Adultery would be entering into sexual relationships with somebody who is married or engaged. That's what that would mean in this particular cultural context. But certainly that disrupts stable life. So it doesn't lead to no life. It's not sterile, but it does lead to a disruption of stable life. And again, my argument would be that our culture is a prime example of what happens when we actually don't have a high view of marriage and marriage vows, both for ourselves and for others who have taken marriage vows. Sacrificing children is mentioned there as well. If it means literally sacrificing children, there's obviously no life in that. But some people argue that this could simply be a reference to devoting a child to temple prostitution, sacrificing their children to other gods in the sense of giving them up to serve as cult prostitutes in other religions. And the actual Hebrew here doesn't mention fire. It simply says causing to pass through, causing your child to pass through. And it could mean passing through some kind of rite of passage or ritual, R-I-T-E, rite of passage. So it doesn't necessarily mean sacrificing children to death, although it could mean that. There are other contexts in the Old Testament that suggest that the Canaanites did practice that, and the Israelites clearly were not to practice that. But there's questions about whether that's what it means here in this chapter. But in any event, they're forbidden to do either one of those things. Also, homosexuality is forbidden in this chapter. Only some would suggest that What is in view here is not homosexual practices in general, but only temple homosexuality, or homosexuality is connected to pagan practices of corrupt worship. We're going to spend hopefully a little bit more time talking about what the Bible teaches about homosexuality in the next lesson, but there are those who would interpret this prohibition in Leviticus 18 more narrowly than just saying homosexual practice as a whole is forbidden in Leviticus chapter 18. Of course, there's plenty of New Testament passages that would prohibit homosexuality, which makes the argument difficult biblically to make that it's an acceptable practice, even if you concede here at Leviticus 18 that it might be more narrow. We'll look at some of that next time. The last thing mentioned in Leviticus 18 is bestiality. Again, sexual relationships with animals. Again, I talked about how last time many of the things that we read here are not areas or expressions of sexual freedom that people are crying for, that are somehow restricted by law today. Many people who are non-believers and who would actually be proponents or advocates of the freedom of sexual expression would not have a problem with these kinds of prohibitions. And here's one of them: bestiality. We are not animals. That we don't simply reproduce by instinct when we're in heat, as if we have no choice. We're not instinctual animals that way, and animals are not suitable partners. You go again back to Genesis chapter 2, when Adam named all the animals, not one was found to be a suitable helper for Adam, and so God created a woman, not another animal. And of course, again, to go back to that original mandate of being fruitful and multiplying, it doesn't lead to life. Bestiality does not lead to life. God is a God of life. And so all of these are sexual relationships that are forbidden outside the scope of family relationships, but forbidden nonetheless in this call to covenant holiness. Third thing here, just to deal with as we wind up, is a call to covenant life. So we looked at a call to covenant faithfulness to the Lord, a call to covenant holiness separate from the nations. Here, a call to covenant life. Because true life in the scriptures is life lived in fellowship with God and according to the pattern of his law. We live a life that is truly life when we're obeying the Lord and walking according to the light of his law. And we have to remember that these boundaries are serving to protect family relationships as the backbone of a stable society. And families were the backbone of stable societies in the ancient Near East cultures. They were the backbone of stable cultures and societies in the 1600s in Europe, and when people came over to the United States. And they are the backbone of stable societies today in the United States and everywhere else in the world, because the family unit is a very important social structure. And when we allow that to deteriorate, that will have far-reaching ramifications. It will ripple out into the rest of the culture eventually. And again, I would argue that we're seeing that now in our culture and in many places around the globe. Derek Tidball offers this summary in his commentary on Leviticus about Leviticus 18. All people were treated with respect rather than used merely as objects to gratify uncontrolled sexual lust. That's what sexual relationships within the covenant are supposed to look like. The people of Israel were called to channel their sexual drives within the boundaries of faithful marriage as God had decreed. That was true for Israel. That's still true today. But there's only one thing that will really motivate this. Obedience to these regulations has to be motivated by covenant faithfulness to the Lord, who redeemed us, who purchased us by his love and his grace. And there's really no other restraint of our sexual drives that is powerful enough and compelling enough for a reason where we will voluntarily deny our strong sexual desires unless there's a higher relationship that compels us to control those things. And of course, that's what happens in marriage, right? That we vow to forsake all others because there's this higher love, this higher commitment to this one other individual for which we will regulate, control, and limit the rest of our sexual expression out of our love for this person and our covenant relationship, our covenant commitment with this person. Well, of course, we even have a higher covenant commitment than just our spouse if we're married. We actually have a covenant commitment with the Lord, and it's ultimately our love for him that motivates obedience in this area. And that's still true of people that I talk with today, that restrictions and fidelity in sexual expression is almost always seen with those who have a vital, living, and real relationship with the Lord. And where that doesn't exist, you don't have people operating within proper boundaries, and you don't have people who are intentionally restraining their sexual desires very often. So again, there are exceptions to that, to be sure. But in general, that's what you see, because we need a powerful and compelling reason for sexual restraint, because as we talked about at the end of the last lesson, our sexual drives are very powerful. And so to limit those, we have to have a reason. But to limit them is very necessary because, as we talked about last time, when our sexual desires overflow banks, it's like a strong river current that becomes very destructive of the things around us. And so it's love for God and not merely outward legislation that motivates those kinds of things. Last thing, remember that this chapter, if you look at it as a whole, is a warning to Israel, God's covenant people, warning them against adopting the immoral sexual practices of the surrounding culture, the Canaanites. And we talked about that as a context of the Holiness Code before. But notice that if they were to follow the immoral practices of the Canaanites, whose land they were entering in, they would also be judged and exiled from the land, just like the Canaanites were. So the Canaanites are being driven out because of the abomination of their practices. We'll see that in a later chapter. But if the Israelites follow course, that will happen to them as well. Because listen, as sin could defile the sanctuaries we've talked about in the earlier chapters of the book, sexual immorality could also defile the land, which would bring judgment. And so we actually have already seen this in a way. Sin has already polluted the world, and it was judged in the flood. But even the flood appears to have been connected to a forbidden sexual union of some kind between the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis chapter 6. Now, there's lots of ideas about what that exactly means. I don't tend to take a very fanciful idea of what that means, as if angels were being sexually active with humans. I don't take it to mean that, but there is a clear sexual union that lies behind this corruption of the people at the time of the flood. And the earth was judged because of that. And so this idea of the sinfulness of sexual immorality is something that pervades the scriptures, not just in the Old Testament, but the New Testament. And sin will be judged. And so I want to spend a little bit more time talking about that judgment aspect and how we as Christians can speak to that truthfully, but also graciously, and also how we can speak truthfully and graciously about issues related to homosexuality today, and how we have to understand the fuller biblical teaching on homosexuality, and not just as we see it here in Leviticus chapter 18. So that warrants a little bit more time, and we'll plan to take a look at that next time. So hopefully you'll join us then.